had great fun preparing this presentation, trying to follow what I said I was going to do. And then as I got into reading revisiting some of the research about using mixed methods in teaching and learning in online environments, I just got more and more excited about it. So let me see if I can figure out how to, okay. Let me just say a little bit about my background. He mentioned that I found in my life a little late in my academic career, actually. Toward the very end of my academic career, I started publishing books because I had been discouraged from publishing books while I was an assistant and associate professor. And then ultimately I got to the point that I really wanted to build on some of the teaching that I had been doing. So that was my first book that focuses on integrated designs, and we'll talk about integrated and non-integrated designs. And then in the project where we overlap, I got into looking more specifically at pairing mixed methods with a qual methodology like grounded theory. And now I'm deep into all kinds of visuals. So the visual landscape is one that I think is very compatible to you. So I am a research methodologist now. I've spent probably the good part of the last 8 years immersed in the mixed methods literature. When you're a methodologist, that means you're interdisciplinary. So I'm always on the hunt for good examples, and they come from incredibly diverse areas. So I make it my purpose to read broadly, to try to find examples from very diverse disciplines rather than concentrating on a few. And in all of my books, I have concentrated on the work by and large that students produce during their graduate work, during their dissertations. I try to showcase the work of a younger generation of up and coming scholars. That's a part of my activism, particularly in terms of visual methods and integration. There's so much going on in mixed methods now that so it's hard to keep up almost. So I told you that in preparing for this, I got pretty excited about the topic, thinking about teaching and learning in online and digital environments. Now, most of the publications that I've dealt with have been in online teaching rather than maybe the more expansive digital. But before I tell you the broad aims, I want to see if I could present an image of why it is a near perfect environment for a mixed methods approach. And that is because there's several reasons for that. So I'm talking about the teaching and learning online. The data are there. They're collected automatically. There are all kinds of data collected in the online environment. You can talk about frequency of interaction, a quantitative indicator. You can talk about interaction over time. People have explored who's interacting with whom. So you've got networks and connections that are sometimes pictured in social network analysis. You even have what this fantastic author, who I'll refer to several times, refers to as ghosting or vapor trails. And that's the data that are available about students who are reading. You could see that what they're reading, even if they're not necessarily posting comments. So one little caveat I'll give you, I did teach online multiple times, and actually that's kind of what motivated me to write my first book. But it's been 4 years maybe since I've taught online, so I hope I'm not terribly out of date. But this particular research used this Gasson and Waters. I'll talk about it more. They use participation in what we call then discussion boards. I don't know if it's still called that, but it is good. That's good. In these online course delivery modules. So what I'm saying, two things. You got a lot of data. So that's a plus. You got a lot of naturally occurring data in the online environment. That's a plus. And the data is already paired in the sense that you can identify individuals or by their pseudonyms or by their numbers, and you can do relationships. There are several other environments that are such a natural fit. Some research in some mixed method research in urban affairs and planning has the same sort of multidimensionality to it, where you've got the lived experience in spaces. Research in criminology also is another place where there's a ton of data that you can use in creative ways. So I think the potential is huge. And there are a couple of people that have done some really exemplary studies, and this is one of them. Gasson is very senior and knows a lot about grounded theory. Some of the other examples are not necessarily by such senior people. So I was trying to do a little bit for everybody in this presentation. So we'll kind of do an introduction, some basic information, definitional issues for people who have had little exposure to mixed methods. Then we'll go up a notch and distinguish between integrated and non-integrated mixed methods designs with something, with what's in between. I'll spend just a little bit of time on mixed method analytical procedures with a lot of focus on how those are shown in visuals, like social network maps, for example. And then I'll wrap up with a couple examples of resources, and I can always answer questions about more of those resources because there's tremendous resources about mixed methods available online and in free venues. So it's an area where people can make a lot of progress educating themselves. So let's look at the question of a definition of mixed methods. And I'd really like to manipulate this figure because I could make a couple points of it, but it's very simple in that any definition of mixed methods has these three components, that there's a qual component, a quant component, and a mixing component. Definitions vary about the other things they emphasize, but this is at the core. So if you take the mixing out and you have qual and quant that run separate, so maybe first you had a quant study and then you had a qual study, and they're not significantly or meaningfully linked. That's better described as multi-method. Multi-method is also used to describe when you have more than one quant and more than one qual. So knock out that little guy in the middle, the mixing guy, and you don't really have mixed methods. Now the size of these circles, so I was real clever, I could show the qual can be bigger than the quant can be bigger than the qual. So what I've shown you here is like they're all equal. You got a strong qual, got a strong quant, and you got a strong mixing by the picture I presented. Characteristically, since its inception, this is changing very rapidly, I think. The quant has been bigger. It's been more dominant. Sometimes qual is trivialized. The qualitative approach is trivialized. As an example of that is when you sprinkle in a few quotes and present your quant findings and then sprinkle in a few quotes for, quote, human interest. You don't have a lot of qual dominant or qual priority yet. but you do have increasing presence where the two are very strong. And the mixing has been a tremendous center of attention in the last 4 or 5 years. Strangely enough, I date the inception of the formal view of mixed methods to about 1988, the end of the 80s. So it's been around a while, but it was conceived, like many methods at the time, quite quantitatively, I might say. So my own definition of mixed methods pairs with what Jennifer Green, a person whose work influenced me. She has a 207 book, Social Science Inquiry, where she was one of the founding leaders. Not everyone shares her point of view, but I think she presents a logic for mixed methods which resonates deeply with me, and it resonates deeply with people who are working in diverse cultural contexts. So she uses the language of a mixed method way of thinking. And her argument is always that you can better understand complex social phenomena by intentionally engaging different ways of knowing and valuing, and by respectfully valuing those differences. So I pick up on that engaging with the commitment to meaningfully engage multiple perspectives in my own definition of mixed methods research. And that's partly because I have found that when you forget the textbooks and you look at the literature, the examples from the literature, and really my own work is really guided by practice rather than some abstraction. So in writing my first book, I featured 9 exemplars, and they were I had an idea of what it was supposed to be, but then the exemplars were like, I couldn't fit them in tidy categories. I couldn't classify them with standard names. I couldn't figure out when analysis occurred. It was just, they were too complex. They were they were way ahead of the literature. So in engaging this, one of the things, the very concrete ways that you can think of the advantage of meaningfully engaging diverse perspectives is this interest in gaps and silences and in the incongruities presented by your data. So when you start collecting data about the same constructs, so when you start having qual and quant and visual data like interaction patterns about the same constructs, you will encounter differences, which is where the innovation, in my strong opinion, it's where the innovation lies, is when the data doesn't do what you expect it to do. And the example I introduced in the beginning by Gasson and Waters, that whole thing hangs on repudiating the assumption that to learn requires active participation. So the Gasson and Water article refutes that idea and presents data from the online environment to support it. So I'll give you a little teaser on that in a minute, but that's like, as teachers, we're often misled by a student in a class who's very articulate and talks a lot, right? You think, oh, they're the one, they're the one really learning, right? They're the one gonna, blow the top off the class. And then you find people, there are many people, as you know from teaching, who take a while to formulate their words. They take a while to formulate their ideas. And so this research really, I think, builds on the idea that those people are learning as much, if not more, I guess you would say. So some core assumptions of mixed methods, and this is all approaches to it. It's associated with the concept of triangulation. And triangulation is a quality measure. The language is mostly used in qual, but that's the idea when you have multiple points of view, multiple points of data, and you bring them together, that enhances quality. Another big assumption, which was in the title of the presentation, is that by pulling together different sources of data and different analytical procedures, you have the potential for synergy when the sum is greater than the parts. So you could think of mixed methods as, okay, you had a qual finding and a quant finding. Okay, that's one. Mike Fetter says that's 1 + 1. So it's cumulative. You have the parts are separate, but you learn something from each. In the synergy idea, it's when you put the parts together, such as in the example I just gave you from Gasson. You have the potential to create something that's significantly greater than what you learn from the parts. And I think I have an example later on of that one. A mix of approaches is required to advance knowledge. And that is an assumption that isn't restricted to mixed methods. That's an assumption that crosses methods, many methods. And then the idea that diverse perspectives, that's why teams work so well. Diverse perspectives contribute to knowledge. So if you can avoid the conflict of diverse perspectives and, oh, in your discipline, you think about it this way, but in our discipline, we think about it that way. So here's some core assumptions of mixed methods. So let me see if I could summarize that synergy article that's in that synergy argument that's in the title, returning to the example of the Gasson and Waters article. So they learned from the quant who was interacting the most and who was interacting with whom. And they identified thought leaders and then tried to trace who they were interacting with. In the qual, they went into the discussion board and classified interactions by the type of role it played. So as I said, they had the thought leader, they had the devil's advocate. So I think they identified 6 different types of participation, 6 different types of participation with qual. And then when they put the qual and the quant together, it wasn't necessarily the most frequent interactors because they had grades and quiz scores. And of course, you could do a content analysis of the posting, that they found that the passive ghost vapor learners were learning vicariously through the conversations. So they were learning vicariously. It wasn't the amount of interaction that was in the quant. It wasn't it was partly the type because that was in the qual, but they were learning vicariously just by watching the conversation. Those are the ones that probably come in late. So there's also data about, how far into the conversation the people come in.